Hey there, and welcome to another Fluent English Conversation, the podcast where I talk about a different subject every episode so that you can learn new vocabulary and practice your English listening skills. So sit back, relax, and let's talk about something interesting today. As always, just a quick note, make sure you download your transcript so you can read along and study while I'm speaking. The subject that we're going to be talking about today is loanwords. English is a language that's spoken all over the world in lots of different countries and cities by lots of different people, which means it's very common and understandable that lots of foreign words have entered the English language and are used on a daily basis by native speakers and by students. These words range from anything related to food and other concepts or things which don't exist in the English-speaking world which do in other places. Some of these words are used directly as they are used in their native language, and some of them are anglicised, where we take the original word and then we make it a little bit more English. For example, when we think of Italian words, most Italian food keeps the original Italian name, but sometimes they can be adjusted a little bit. So, for example, mozzarella is mozzarella, whereas in America they say zucchini, which is the Italian word, but in America you say one zucchini, which is singular, whereas in Italian zucchini is actually the plural form. So sometimes, although it's the actual word, it gets adjusted a little bit. So they actually say two zucchinis. And in the UK we say courgette. We also don't even use the Italian word in that instance. Whereas there are other things like parmesan, which is parmigiano reggiano, and that has a completely different name. So it's not a hard and fast rule that all food maintains the original name, but in a lot of cases food tends to be something that keeps the original name without too much adjusting. Whereas there are lots of other concepts, especially in English from languages like French, where we take the word and we adjust it, but we also have some Latin phrases that are kept in the original Latin, for example, like vice versa, or CV, which is short for curriculum vitae. Another interesting point is most other languages also take English words and use them now because it's such a common international word. It's the lingua franca, if you like, which is a French term that we use. And in that way, there are lots of times when English words are used incorrectly or they are not used in the original way that we use them in English. So, for example, in English, a trolley is something you use in the supermarket to put all of your food in and push it around. Whereas in Italy, il trolley is a suitcase, is what you pack your clothes in to go on holiday. And so in that case, it's become a false friend, even though it is actually the English word. And then there are other examples like parking, which is the general activity in English, is actually the name of a car park in Italian. So il parking is actually the parking space or the car park. So it can be a little bit confusing that even when you think you recognize a particular word, it may not always mean the same thing in English or in another language. So you have to be a little bit careful with these loan words that we have adopted. The main reason I thought it would be really interesting to talk about this today is because there is a bit of a difficult situation when you are choosing to use a word that's used in a foreign language when you speak that language. So for native speakers, they don't really have this problem. When they say mozzarella, they don't speak Italian, so they don't know the traditional pronunciation. In the same way that if they choose a Japanese word, they just know whatever the English version is that most people say. And then as a native speaker who speaks some additional languages, I have the difficult choice of deciding, do I say it the way that other English people say, or do I copy the correct pronunciation from the original language? It's a difficult choice, to be perfectly honest, because in some situations I actually would choose to use the anglicised version, even though I know that's technically not the correct pronunciation for that particular word. And in other situations I would use the original authentic pronunciation for different reasons. The thing to consider, I guess, is for an average native speaker, they maybe don't know the correct or original pronunciation. So if somebody uses the authentic pronunciation, it can often come across as being a little bit pompous, trying to sound very intelligent, like you're trying to make them feel a little bit stupid because they don't know the correct way to say it. They only know the sort of idiot's way, if you like. And obviously no one would ever really want to do that, or I would assume most people wouldn't, but some people might take it almost as an offense, or they might feel like you're trying to make yourself sound better or more intelligent or, above them, which isn't really what you want to achieve. And in those contexts, that's when, for example, the languages I speak, like Italian or Spanish or Japanese, I would say those words in the English way, even though I know how to pronounce them correctly, because I don't want people to think I'm trying to say, like, look at me, I'm Sam, I speak languages, I'm so much better, because that's not the case. But on the other hand, if I was speaking to non-native speakers like Italians or Spanish people, or Spaniards as we call the group term there, I would actually choose the authentic pronunciation because I believe it's easier for them to understand what I'm trying to say, especially if it is actually an Italian or a Spanish word. I would choose to use the correct pronunciation with those people because I actually want them to understand what I'm saying. And often when a word is taken from your own language and pronounced differently in another language, it can actually be really difficult to identify that word. And I always like to focus on being understood and about communication. And that would be my main consideration. So, for example, if you say to an Italian speaker, oh, mozzarella, they don't always, or they may not always recognize that you mean mozzarella, which again, my pronunciation there is not perfect because I'm not an Italian speaker, but they are more likely to understand the second version because that is closer to or what they would normally say. And in the same way for native speakers, when people pronounce things with a strong accent and it can be difficult for us to understand, there are certain cases, even when I'm learning other languages, where they use an English word, but because the pronunciation is so different, I don't immediately recognize it, even if the context is the same. Based on that concept of coming across as maybe a little bit pompous or arrogant or trying to make yourself seem better and looking down on people, I would be a little bit careful, even if you are from the place where that word is originally from. If your pronunciation is very good in English, it sometimes can be better to mimic what a native speaker would expect rather than speaking with a very good British accent for everything except when there's an Italian word and then putting the Italian in there. It sometimes doesn't come across in the right way. However, if you are a student and you have an Italian accent, nobody will believe that when you say Italian words because it matches your accent. But as a native speaker, it clearly stands out when I say a whole sentence with English words and English pronunciation, and then I suddenly chuck a Spanish word in there, but I keep the Spanish pronunciation. And it stands out as different, so people believe I've made that choice for a particular reason, and so then they try to assign meaning to whatever that reason might be. This might not be something you've actually ever even considered, and it's not something I want you to particularly worry about. It's just something to keep in mind as you develop your skills and as you reach a higher level. There is a particular reason why certain speakers will choose to use the anglicized pronunciation of a word or the authentic pronunciation of a word. Another example where they do this is in cooking. A lot of chefs are trained in the traditional French methods, and a lot of them will go to France to do this. And so most professional chefs like Gordon Ramsay, people like that, they learn French because they go and work in France and they learn those traditional techniques. And so when they are talking about those techniques, they will often actually use the correct French pronunciation for particular terms because other chefs know the same terms, the same lingo, and so that's where it gets a little bit different. But there is also the other side where if they use that with the customers, some customers will believe it's because the chef thinks they're better, which actually isn't the case. So you see where I'm going with this, that it's actually quite a complicated issue, and it's something that a lot of people don't really consider, and that's why I thought it'd be really interesting to talk about it, to really open your eyes to how different pronunciation and different language can be perceived by different people, even when you're just trying to use a particular word. My advice is, if it's from your own native language, pronounce it exactly like you normally would, and it's absolutely fine. If you notice a word from a different language, or if your English pronunciation is extremely good and you don't have a clear native accent, which a lot of advanced speakers will find themselves in that situation, what you need to do is just to be careful that you are not choosing particular pronunciation in a way that makes it seem like you are trying to appear like you're better. And while we're on this topic of loan words, I also want to talk about false friends and words that are actually the same, but maybe the usage is a little bit different. So in English, we have a lot of words that come from Latin. So if you look at medical vocabulary, it's basically the same as the Latin languages like Italian and Spanish, because they have the same roots and those academic subjects tend to keep the Latin origins of words. But in everyday conversation, a lot of those Latin-based words tend to sound very formal and academic. So again, a bit like choosing the correct pronunciation for a word so that it sounds more English, it's also a good idea to remember that even when there is an Italian word or a Latin word, it may not actually be the most appropriate. It may also not be the most appropriate in a particular context. Informally or conversationally, a lot of the time those Latin verbs especially will be replaced by a phrasal verb. And it sounds much more natural, much more conversational to use that phrasal verb. So if you are at a lower level and you are using the English equivalent of the words you normally use in your native language if you speak a Latin language, that sounds perfectly fine because it's all about being understood. But as you develop, you want to understand that some of those words have a different tone, a different register, and there will be certain contexts where you may not use those words or those particular phrases because they just sound out of place. So there will be certain vocabulary if you was writing a technical report at work that you wouldn't use if you were just having a chat with a pint in the pub. This register and tone, again, is very difficult to just explain in a simple way because different regions, different countries, different people and professions all have slightly different ideas of exactly how that works. So certain terms in the UK might be considered very differently than terms that are used in the US or in Australia or in other English-speaking parts of the world. So it's really about understanding the context and reading the room to see exactly what's being done. And if you have native speaker friends or you have a teacher, it's always a good idea to ask them when you're saying particular phrases, if there is a word that is an exact match for what you would normally say, is that the natural way? Are there alternatives? Is there a different way you could say it that's more conversational? Or, on the other hand, if you say it in a conversational way already, what's the more formal academic way? What alternative verbs do we have? And then you can get the full variety and the full spectrum of expression, and then you can choose that to be more precise and more accurate and sound more fluent. All of these skills and all of these things that you consider are the things that you need to look at when you're moving from the upper intermediate to the advanced area, where you are starting to polish your English a little bit more to make it sound much more natural, much more fluent, and much more accurate. And you want to add that extra level of precision. So at that level, you're not really just focusing on saying something now. You want to say exactly what you want, how you want, why you want it. And these are just extra things on top of all the normal stuff like vocabulary. But it's just good to remember that when you are speaking, the words you choose, how you phrase things, there are often lots of other things behind it, subtext, that you may not be aware of, and that being aware of it and learning about it can actually really help you to understand the people you're speaking to and the culture and all of that better, which then will naturally improve your English as well. So a little bit of a different topic today, something that's not exactly just learning some interesting vocabulary or talking about a story I have, but something I thought would be really interesting to share and not something I often hear English teachers talking about during lessons. So we're going to leave it there for today, and I hope you found this topic really interesting, and I would love to hear if you've got any particular questions, or I'd like to just hear your thoughts about what you think of this particular topic. So take a second now that you've made it to the end of the episode, and thanks again for listening the whole way through, and just put a little comment below and let me know what you think. If you liked it, what you think of the subject, what your thoughts are. I'd love to hear from you. So have a fantastic week, have a great day learning English, and I look forward to speaking to you very soon.